The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss, bringing you the second part of my three-part lecture on the fourth movement of Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique. Here's some food for thought as we jump into this middle section, which is probably the most memorable part of the movement, if not the entire symphony. And that is that we've looked at the form of this symphony so far, starting with a sonata allegro, and then having sort of a waltz-like scherzo, progressing from there to a pastoral movement, and now here a march movement, and then we will finish with a big rondo at the end. As we've gone along the way, we've noticed how Berlioz evoked different programmatic references for each of those movements. For instance, the discovery of the idée fixe in the beginning and his obsessions over it, then seeing her at a fancy dress ball and becoming obsessed with her and having the music of that ball follow him wherever he went afterwards. And then, of course, the pastoral movement where he is missing her and thinking about his own life. And here, with this march to the scaffold, now there had been a couple of marches in Beethoven symphonies, and certainly using the orchestra to perform march music was not unique to Beethoven. It cropped up here and there in other works, mainly operas and so on. But the context here, I feel, is so original. In Beethoven's case, he used the march mainly as a symbolic vehicle to express his feelings about revolution and individuality and commemorating the fall of a hero and so on and so forth. But in this case, I feel, to put the march in the connotation of a march to one's doom is incredibly original, and I don't know if anybody attempted that after Berlioz within his time. Also, let's not forget the sense of irony and putting on a brave face that I mentioned before. So that is certainly in the music, along with a kind of exaggerated positivity of the soldiers marching the condemned artist to his doom. While this music is very triumphant, there certainly is a sinister side to it as well. So keep that in mind when you are listening to this glorious march. There are many emotional layers to it, and its wonderful simplicity and positiveness in certain passages shouldn't be taken at face value. Now let's take a look at this fantastic passage. We had a hint of this theme right at the beginning. Bum, 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 bum. Of course, that was against a G minor drone, and it was played by very sinister stopped horns. But here we see, when it's underpinned by B flat, then it becomes this happy major march. This page is just so extraordinary. Notice that there are no strings for most of the passage. They just come in at the end to sort of agree with everything that happened before. And they're hitting very, very hard, and at least for the violins, are playing these double stops in tenths and octaves with one of the strings open, which really, really helps the resonance. These octaves here will have fingered pitches on either end, and that will still be nice and loud. And the same thing is true of these Fs. So it's something that the string section can really dig into, especially if they have nothing better to do than just to set their fingers and get ready to play this. It will come off very, very loud compared to this big mass that's come before it. So let's take this apart, starting with some of the most fascinating elements, which are not even the melody. First of all, something that gets mentioned a lot in orchestration manuals and in orchestration lectures, classrooms when they're introducing the trombone, is the presence of this big, beautiful, blatting B-flat fundamental here, played by the third trombone. This is really going to wail, and you can hear it very clearly in the recording that I'm using. It has this wonderful directness and resonance, and is really almost psychotic, and I can see why Berlioz used it. Once again, showing that this very positive march has multiple emotional layers. I think by underpinning it with this nasty B-flat right here, which would probably sound a lot better on Ophicleide if you wanted it to sound good, by putting it in this really, really raunchy kind of register for the third trombone, I think Berlioz is really saying that there is a level of phoniness to the entire operation. We are perceiving what the artist is perceiving. We are getting their take on things. And in that case, this is sort of pre-impressionistic, isn't it? It is really from the point of view of one person, and that is also the composer, who is putting themselves in the scene. So it's not really impressionistic, but it has some foundational approaches that will eventually evolve in that direction. In this case, though, these really grinding B-flats are so beautiful. They really set the scene. And notice that Berlioz has put in a cautionary dynamic marking here of mezzo forte. He's telling that trombonist, look, just don't let those howl, or else you will knock everybody else off of the stage. In this recording, I feel the trombonist could have just been a teeny bit louder, but I was not there to conduct those young musicians and to balance everything on stage and to hear what the hall was like. So I cannot really say if that was a wrong decision or not. I just felt like I could have heard a little bit more of them, not a lot. We also have our Ophicleide just bopping back and forth between these two B-flats. Very, very fun. And it can be very deceptive when you see something like this with a lot of eighth rests, and you see, say, a timpani part like this one with quarter notes that have no eighth rests in them, and to think, well, this is going twice as fast. But actually, my advice for developing score readers is just to look at the cardinal beats of each measure. In this case, we can see that the Ophicleide and the timpani are really playing the same 4 beats in each bar. Of course, they're not playing the same notes in each bar. The Ophicleide, by jumping up to this higher B-flat, gives some space to this little D down here. And then the same thing is true when it goes up again. We've got the F in here. So there is a slight sense of nebulosity to the second and fourth quarter notes of each bar. And that is sort of tied into a nice little package of feeling like it more or less is the 1s and the 5s, or just the 1s and maybe a higher 1 and so on, by the ear, just because of this really powerful trombone playing. Let's talk about that timpani. Now, I sort of gave the game away a little bit in the previous lecture by talking about this, but I just want to underline it again, and that is the timpani should be positioned on either side of the stage. So there will be one little nest to the left of the back of the hall, and there will be another little nest on the right-hand side. And when you get into passages like this, it really feels like feet moving. These two nests of timpani that are pounding back and forth really feel like giant legs marching across the orchestra. So that is just sheer genius. And notice something about this. The only other weight that we are seeing here in these first 4 bars, in terms of the bass, is just adding the bassoons here. These other pitches in the bassoons really don't get down to a bass tone until the second bassoon comes in here on this B flat. Everything else is positioned much higher, and there aren't any first and second trombones. So, despite all of that, it has a very, very powerful bass, a very propelling kind of musical momentum happening. This is going to be a slightly lopsided sort of lecture. I'll be really discussing these two screens in a lot of detail. And then when we get to the second part, you'll see that the material on these two screens is reused several times. So there will be less to chat about except for tiny little changes. So you'll just notice that the beginning of this lecture, even though it only covers 2 screens, about 16 bars, will be quite a bit longer than the second half. So we've talked about the bass right in here. Moving forwards, we can see that the ophicleide now comes into its own, digging in to these low E flats, and then F and G. The role of the third trombone as being this real rock-solid, nasty, blatting kind of instrument is really removed. And of course this F is not a fundamental, and it's a perfectly solid note. The ophicleides go right back to their octave B flats, and then at the end do this little walk down and jump up to F, which is the 5, setting this up right in here, which in turn sets up the 1 at the beginning of the next bar. Okay, so pretty basic bass writing. You can see the octaves in here between the second trombone and the ophicleide. And it's interesting here that the timpani are not tuned to E flat, but they provide part of the chord. This is the kind of scoring that works for Berlioz, but it's a little risky today. There are ways of doing this kind of thing which are less brutal, trying to convey this sort of thing. I would say leave out the G's and just hammer on these B flats, and you'll get pretty much the same exact effect. There's really no need to bring in the G's, except in Berlioz's case, he wants it to be just incredibly brutal. And some of those pitches are being doubled in our bassoons. You'll notice that the first bassoon doesn't track perfectly with what's going on in the second trombone. It jumps up to the harmony right in here. And then it joins in with the rest of the upper instruments rather than the bass instruments. So once again, we're seeing really good bassoon writing, more chordal kinds of scoring, and then relinquishing themselves to helping out with the bass where it's needed, jumping back into more of a role, playing along with the brass and the upper winds and so on. That is really, really typical bassoon scoring. So that pretty much covers everything that's going on in the bass for the winds and the brass. Now, let's talk about the melody, finally. Here we're going to really see the entire reason why the horns are a bit upside down. Yes, it says B flat here. I would have written something in here to indicate that it was B flat bass, but that's all right. It's perfectly fine to score it this way too. So we've got bass horns above E flat horns, which are scored higher. And if you remember from earlier in the symphony, the E-flat horns were being played by the first and the second, and then C horns were being played by the third and the fourth. A C basso, a lower crook for our natural horns. Now we've got it flipped. So why is that? I explained this in the introductory lecture, but of course I should mention it when we get to the actual section where this occurs. The reason why is because Berlioz wants the best players in the orchestra to not only be involved in things that happened before, that involved low playing of some nasty stopped pitches and so on, but especially he wants his best players to be tracking the melody from an octave below. Now, the melody is a bit schizophrenically scored across the trumpets and the cornets. And there is a slight risk here, and you will hear it, in that the trumpets start off with the melody, and then they pound away at these Gs right in here. And if an orchestra is not careful, then these unison Gs and these octave Gs can just really take over the middle of the sound picture and blot out the melody to a degree as it goes forwards. This orchestra escapes that problem, but the problem is in the music. It's not just in the orchestra. And the reason for that problem is because you've got the gentler cornets playing the melody up here. If I were scoring this, I probably would have flipped this around and had the trumpets play this part and the cornets play this part. I wonder if a conductor has ever chosen to do that. In the middle of the 20th century, conductors flipped parts and did all sorts of little fixes. Nowadays, they tend to fix from the podium and just try to balance things with the players playing a little bit more, a little bit less than is in the score. Be that as it may, we're starting off here, bum 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 bum, with sixths going to fifths, going to thirds, and the cornets are just really underlining that top written C sounding B flat, going to thirds instead of fifths, so it makes a nice big F major triad. And then both the instruments ending up here, keeping in mind these are both B flat instruments, right? So they have the same exact transposition. Now the cornets are going forwards, bum ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum 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 bum. And here we are going to jump right back to our horns, which I hadn't forgotten about. It's exactly the same pitches. However, since these are B-flat basso horns, they're going to sound down a major ninth. So whatever transposition we're doing here to think of everything sounding down a whole step applies as well to the B-flat horns, plus an octave. The resonance of the horns below is pushing at the octave above, which will make the fundamental timbre of the tones in here very, very rich, and they also add something to the body of tone, which is going to be floating an octave above both the trumpets and the cornets, because the horns also sound quite penetrating 2 octaves higher. So it all combines together very, very richly. It's some basic brass band scoring, let's face it. But in an orchestral sense, it has just an extra spice because you've got these fantastic players, world class, usually in recordings today, and they are just putting everything into a more brass band or military band kind of context. It's just remarkable results, and it really shows what can be done with really great band scoring. And in saying that, I'm not knocking band players. Some of our military bands and marching bands and concert bands contain just fantastic players as well. But it is a different approach and it's a different culture. So to take this approach and to let concert players loose on it is also an act of genius, I feel. The difference probably meant a little bit less back in Berlioz's time, but as those worlds have separated, the effect becomes more and more potent. So really, it's the horns that are playing the full version of the melody going across, and the trumpets and the cornets are playing an adaptation, in that the cornets here are not playing the sixths, they're not playing the fifth, and then by this point they do play the full version of the melody as harmonized in the horns. As to the E-flat horns, they're basically playing harmony around and in between the horns and the trumpets and cornets. And it really fills things in and sounds terrific. When we get to here, a part that really reaffirms our tonic, you can see the trumpets changing their focus from G's to C's, in concert pitch, F's to B flats. And they're going to remain there on B flats and F's and so on, a B flat third, and these F octaves. Because to Berlioz's mind, even being the revolutionary, that was still a traditional place for the trumpets to be, really hitting the ones and the fives and the occasional 5 of 5. He had his cornets, and they were chromatic, and they could do a lot of things, but of course, they didn't have the power that trumpets had, which just takes us back to that problem of these ones and fives in the trumpets being a little too loud, or easily getting out of control if the trumpet players are too lusty. I mean, you could solve that problem just by having the cornets being played by trumpets as well, but then you have too much high end, and things don't blend together with the element I'm just about to go over, and that is the winds. But let's just take this apart a little bit before we look at the role of the winds. I really love this melodic curve, the way it sort of snakes its way to the top here, and then jumps down by intervals, thirds, and then fourths, and then leaps up again, and does another little sort of snaky bit. It's all beautiful horn writing, sixths and thirds, and the occasional fourth and fifth. Some of those same pitches are being played an octave higher by cornets, and doubling along, playing more in thirds than anything else. Here you get a fifth, third, fourth, sixth kind of thing happening. So it does sort of pull away from what's going on in the B-flat horns. At a certain point, the horns stop playing the exact melody, and that is left to the cornets and some of the winds. Really, the top line here, F sounding E-flat, is walking down to C, sounding B-flat, and then walking right back up to G. So the horns are covering some of those pitches, and in some cases going a little lower so that they come back under, harmonizing. It's all just a fun little game, which is somewhat taken away by the fact that there are no natural instruments really being played in the orchestra anymore. So you don't have to do some of these calculations, but they're kind of fun to do, I think, and they're fun to take apart. We have this third horn right in here, supplying some of the same pitches from time to time. For instance, you've got this sounding E-flat, and that's the same exact thing that is being played by this E-flat horn here, the third horn player. So extra reinforcement on that line, which is the same thing an octave lower than this. One of the things I love about the syncopations in these 4 bars is that it's a little deceptive, the way that Berlioz pulls back here on these syncopations right in here, and then starts here going 1E and 4, 3E and 4. So the the casual listener who is just not paying attention can almost feel like Berlioz has added or subtracted a bar, even though it's a very, very square 4 bars. This is the kind of thing that would eventually be imitated by Tchaikovsky, who would have 4-bar, 8-bar, 16-bar phrases, and he would just try to see how much he could mess up the casual listener in exactly the same way. All right, so now let's talk about the winds. One of the things that is fun to notice is that the winds double, but they double a little imperfectly. And that's really, really fun to witness. So let's look at the very, very perfect flutes to start off with. So we've got the same exact thing happening here that is happening 2 octaves below in the horns. Bum 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 ba dum ba da ba ba bum 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 bum. The same exact thing, all right? Except it doesn't quite match in every single note. For instance, here we've got a 6th, there we've got a 4th. Here we've got a 6th, there we've got a 3rd. So Berlioz is making a few little compromises just for a better resonance for the flutes. Now continuing on, bum 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 bum. Same 4ths, 3rds instead of 5ths, 4ths instead of 6ths. And here is something quite interesting, how the second flute comes in under the oboe. This is the kind of scoring, once again, that is probably not that advisable today, especially considering that the flute is not just under the oboes, it is under the first cornet. It's doubling the second cornet. So it is just going to become invisible right around here. It'll be very audible right around here, but then just disappear. So I don't agree with everything that Berlioz did. I can acknowledge that he's a genius without agreeing with him. I think that probably the best thing to do here would be to jump up an octave with the second flute, because their part really becomes inaudible right in here. Sometimes that's not enough of a reason to change the part, though. So I'm a little on the fence about that, but if I were one of those brave conductors of the 50s who just, I'm not saying wise, but brave conductors of the 50s who changed things to suit themselves, I would probably just jump this up the octave. Now, who else is covering the melody? I have to turn off my urge to just transpose the 3rd line of a standard 4-stave wind section, to turn off my transposition and to remember that this is written in concert pitch. Same exact thing. Bum 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 dun 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 dun. The clarinets playing the same thing as the cornets and the trumpets, once again with different harmonic voicings, right? 4ths instead of 6ths, 3rds instead of 5ths, and so on. And that just fills things in. There won't be any problem hearing the second trumpet here, and there won't be any problem hearing the second clarinet there, and it will really make things nice and rich. So it's pretty much an identical copy. And here we are seeing, once again, differences in harmonic voicings, 6ths instead of 4ths, and so on. But what's intriguing here is that the unison clarinets really are playing kind of the guts of the melody, walking all the way down to this B flat and then up to F. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody else who's playing the melody plays this if they want to be authentic? Hardly. We can see that the first bassoon joins in and then walks up to F right alongside. And we can see that the oboe joins in an octave higher, and the first oboe continues on walking up to F. And we can see that the cornet, while it is playing along at first with the first clarinet on the same exact pitch, it jumps up an octave just so that it can be brighter. And it also helps to fill in what's going on in here. So now that we've picked that apart, we can see how the other instruments play around those essential roles, can't we? Whether we've got the harmonization from below of the bassoons, notice that the first bassoon starts off the same exact way as the unison clarinets, harmonizing from below, and then just jumps up again when things get maybe a little too low for the weight of the melody. We can see that the oboes harmonize in between the flutes and the clarinets in a similar way to how the E-flat horns harmonized in between the trumpets, cornets, and the first and second basso B-flat horns. Very similar role on the first two notes. But then we see the oboes joining together with the clarinets and playing identically, more or less, with a couple of little changes, like right in here. But back to their middle roll, right in here. Then they take the melody an octave higher from the clarinets and add intervals right in there. Now that is just the first page, and I have really gone into huge detail about this. You're probably ready to listen to this, but let's turn to the next screen. Here you can see that really it's the same exact thing again that we just looked at for the first four bars. Bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum ba-bum ba-bum bum bum bum. And we can see all of those same rolls for all the same instruments. The bassoons jumping in here after they harmonize at the beginning, that low B flat there and so on, the big blatting third trombone on that low fundamental B flat, the timpani banging back and forth on different sides of the stage. So it's all the same. So pat yourself on the back, you know how these first four bars go. The strings do this big swoop up to an A flat. Very, very cool. I love this little detail here. Pizzicato on that low A flat in the basses really does make a difference. And it gives some weight to these trombone and ophicleide notes. So really the only thing left to analyze is these four bars. So I hope you'll bear with me. We'll play it in just a few minutes. Now here, the winds are a bit more direct in terms of handling the melody. And that is because in reaching for this high A flat, the melody really has to become the province of the winds rather than so much the brass. There will be some brass on the melody, but their role is now less important. There's a bit of trickery as well. Berlioz has set this up as a massive brass chorale, and then going forwards, so long as the brass have a big, huge presence, and there are bits and pieces of melody strewn throughout, like we see right in here, and right in here, then the audience feels like the brass are continuing to play the melody. Haha. Okay, so let's look at that melody then. Octave A flats, the second flute being doubled by both the first oboe and the first clarinet. So there's a lot of weight right there in the middle. So you really don't need to have both flutes on top there. And then walking down in thirds works great. It walks all the way down for our C clarinets. Here, the oboes can't go that low, so they jump up an octave, and it's a really, really great place to be firming up the flutes as they become weaker, getting towards their middle register. And then they all play together. Ba-ba-da-ba-da. Same thing in the oboes. So we've got 4 wind instruments playing right there. We've got our unison clarinets. All right, so I'll just mention it again because I don't know who is coming into these lectures as their first lecture. But don't use the word unison on your winds and your brass, okay? That is a big no-no today. Just say how many instruments. A2, right? So if you have 4 bassoons, you could say A4 if you had a unison line, as we've seen in the previous lecture. So that's the treatment of the melody in our winds, and we have some harmony elements here. We've got some counter melody elements here. We've got the second clarinet walking up from A flat to this D, and we've got the same thing happening an octave lower in the bassoons, walking up to that D in tenor clef, and of course those exact same notes being played by our 4th horn, which is really going to be stopping some pitches and compromising and so on to be able to get all of those down. Really would take an excellent horn player, I think, to attain all of these pitches in a really beautifully even way. And then we're seeing that same exact line in the 3rd trombone and ophicleide. So what else is there to do for our brass section but to fulfill a much more traditional role to kind of back up the harmony behind the winds and strings if the strings were playing. In this case, we have got an A flat 6th. So A flat with the F on top, the connotation of F minor, which changes as that lower line ascends. A lot of weight on A flat, in fact, because we've got that same note being played an octave higher by A2 trumpets and A2 cornets, ending on an accented B flat right in here. He is just setting up a 5 and a 1, so we're going to these Fs being hammered by the trumpets and then eventually ending up in B flat. Here we see the cornets joining in on the melody right in here, and as they get down to these written E thirds, we have the E flat horns take over. It's the same exact pitch. And they continue that downward trend. And of course, the first horn joins in on the melody as well. Then we get some harmonization below that upward arpeggio, sounding B flat, D, F, and then ending on a B flat above, where all the other instruments are going D, F, A, B flat. And that is how this works. That was some real microscopic detail there. Listen to this several times and listen to different elements. Like the first time you listen through, focus in on how the bass line is really staying emphatic, even though it's so lightly scored, with hardly any help from the bassoons, except for 1 or 2 places. Hardly any help from the other trombones, mainly just 3rd trombone, blatting out these fundamental B flats, and really timpani and ophicleide taking most of the momentum on their shoulders. No lower strings helping out with the bass line except for just a note here and there. And then listen to it again for the overall effect. Listen for that little magic trick as Berlioz goes from very emphatic melodic scoring in the horns, from there to pulling back on that roll, but giving the impression that they're continuing on as these winds come into their own. And of course, you'll notice that this is going to be reused many times going forward, and that is probably the reason why some conductors, including this one, chose to ignore the repeat. because it really just goes back to the beginning, and the condemned man has to start their march again, be brave, and have the orchestra taking the role of the crowd laughing at them and so on. So I can see the rationale behind leaving that out. Let's not worry about that, though. Let's just listen to these two screens of sheer genius, and I will see you on the other side going forwards in this movement. And now, as you'll see, the second half is going to go really quickly because most of the material we've already covered. However, we are going to get 8 unique bars here, and they are really quickly dealt with. We've got the first and second horns playing in octaves with the trumpets, and the cornets underlining the top of that melody. Bum, 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 bum. The second horns filling in the harmony in the middle, and the third trombone first playing this F, right? And then jumping down to the B flat fundamental, and then sliding out to this A, and it sounds immense, just pushing in on that A. In fact, this should be one of the loudest notes in the entire symphony. However, probably because the trombonist gets the hairy eyeball from the conductor, they might pull it in a little bit and only kind of go to their perceived forte or molto forte. Once again, just ophicleides doing their fun stuff. I love that harmony right in here of the A on the bottom and the G flat on top. Berlioz being cheerfully psychotic, at least for his era. Interestingly, a lot of people really liked that. He had a good instinct for what could be popular, and certainly this was the most popular thing he ever wrote. The brass are so strong in here that the response by the winds tends to sort of come off a little weak, and in fact it is scored weaker. Dun 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 dun. This really powerful note right in here, taking up most of the bar, will be playing while the winds are reacting and the strings are suddenly entering and doing something fun. And it really won't be a whole lot of weight compared to the brass right in here. Basically just a response here on not exactly the same pitches, right? Everything kind of up a third and in a reacting harmony. This kind of scoring right in here, it really is just providing some background energy rather than necessarily calling any attention to itself whatsoever. It's going to give some vitality here and just kind of keep the tension going. Back and forth twice. Nice high scoring here in our first clarinets, and that is something that might as well be used when you've got a shallower, higher pitched clarinet like the C clarinet. Now here we get into something really fun. Timpani and horns. This is going to sort of come off as staccato even when staccato isn't marked. It's just a short note, and there has to be enough space after it so that it doesn't feel like the horns are slurring into the winds, or the winds are slurring into the pizzicato. So it is going to be a short note, more or less staccato. G minor thirds in the timpani, and then the same exact tonality here. This is going to be a G minor chord in our horns. Reaction from the winds. Just a little toot here of a stack of intervals adding up to a G minor chord. Pizzicato forte, just to match the attack of the other instruments. It shouldn't be really loud, but it should be on the same dynamic level as everything else. And then this sort of sigh, slurring forwards, and the winds pick up the next part of the melody. And do you recognize it? Dun, 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 dun. It's that same motive from the beginning of this movement. And various parts of it are traded off again. Once the winds get to this B-flat chord here, then the brass section reacts solely, notice, but not necessarily playing out. Solely pizzicato in this lovely little double timpani stroke with bass drum and a little tish of cymbal. The cymbal player has just been waiting for the entire symphony to play something, and it's so effective that it is a soft note. Then continuing on, sighing downwards. And that same theme is getting towards its conclusion. And it's taken over by pizzicato walking downwards, just really, really simple here. In the first violins, and then the second violins walking down. And notice that Berlioz just keeps pushing it up there. First starting on C, then on E flat, and then octave Gs in our violas and cellos. Then a little bit of violin pizzicato taking us back to the downbeat of the re-entry of our big march theme. And of course, along the way, these soli timpani just really bashing around with each other, starting on a G, then a B flat, then a D, then an F, and the F provides the 5 to go back to the 1. Of course, that's all being underpinned by our double basses, playing low for once, but covering those same pitches, G, B flat, D, F, and then ending on a B flat. Now, from this point onwards, it's pretty much the same exact scoring. A couple of slight differences here and there. Here we can see the second trombone being used to back up the third trombone in these fifths. So the F is not going to be as raucous as the B flat. But I don't know. Some trombonists could play that F with the same coarseness as the B flat. Probably would not be desired, but it might be interesting to hear. But you still end up with this very coarse B flat raucously playing down below. And what is the big difference? Is the strings are being included now. And the strings are doing these kinds of swirling figures. From the bass, we've got the ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da on the tonic. And then we have these octave B-flat arpeggios just going back and forth from B-flat and then doing this little hook right in here and then going back down to B-flat and going back and forth and so on. And the violins are just sort of trading off. This is kind of a broken arpeggiation too, because if you look at the first note of each of these little motives, they happen to be notes that occur in whatever chord is being played by the rest of the orchestra. So here you have F and B flat, which go along with our B flat chord here. When the harmony moves around, we see little compromises right in here. A dipping down to G sharp and then ending on a C, F dipping down to E, and so on. So the swirls, even though they're quite intriguing, they really just do help to spell out the harmony that's going on everywhere else. And you can see it's just really the same thing as before. Once again, with the second trombone taking more of an active role. What's really cool here is how the second trombone comes in here to play what the ophicleide did before. And the ophicleide plays opposite, going up and down, rather than down then up. Kind of fun. And, of course, the third trombone just hammering away at these low B flats. But otherwise, it's pretty much the same thing. Maybe a couple extra notes here of harmony coming from these trombones working together, but hardly even worth mentioning. Our real attention should be down here with these arpeggios happening in our middle strings, and then, of course, continuing on the da-da-da-da-da-da-da, going on with our double basses. Very low scoring right in there for Berlioz. And Continuing on with the swirling in the violins here, and it really feels orchestral at this point, just adding that swirling. Here's a little bit of insight about Berlioz. If you look in his Grand Treatise, he has the notion that string sections shouldn't be too large. He cautions against having too many strings. He feels that they could drown out the brass and the winds. And that is his perspective, coming from a time when winds and brass were not as strong as they are today. So that's just something to keep in mind. These triple stops are all really playable. We have open Gs on the bottom here. We've got an open D there, an open A there, and there. So pretty playable. And of course, stacks of sixths are pretty easy to play. Having this fifth right in here that has to be fingered is not the easiest thing, but of course, since the player does not have to worry about fingering anything else because that's an open tone below, it's not too hard to negotiate. Then of course, you got this A sixth here, and then the fingers just move up slightly and you throw in that D in the bottom. Pretty common sense scoring right in here all together on these triple stops. As the music gets really, really fierce, that is really why you're seeing the strings just hammering away at the cardinal beats here, in the middle, at the beginning, and so on. This big sweep upwards, not as high as before, but certainly very, very effective. Coming in lower gives this upper scoring here in our winds and brass a chance to really shine. Same reaction chord here. Going back to swirling, going back to arpeggios, same thing for everybody else. And then, once again, the winds taking over on the melody, and the brass just filling in some melodic notes here and there. It's exactly as before. We have those climbing trombones and ophicleides, and that same upwards climbing line in our second bassoon and second clarinet, and so on. Now, that climbing line is going to be underlined to an extent by our violins in a real interesting way, and that is by harmonizing upwards. So they're hitting the same A flat here and then harmonizing upwards to C, hitting the same B flat, harmonizing upwards to D flat, B natural to D natural, C to E flat, D flat, and then jumping way up to A flat here, and it just becomes farther and farther apart until the strings can just really hammer on these Cs with, of course, an E flat and the bass. And then Berlioz just gives them some space to get ready for this reaction chord. And then we see some of the same stuff as before. Bum, 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 bum. With our strings right in here playing these sextuplets. Interesting how this almost appears to be a reaction to the timpani, right? Taking over some of their role rhythmically. Same thing again. Then we have that same boom, toot, pluck, and sigh, da-da-da, and so on. And it really is kind of the same thing as before, but it is setting up something different. So we'll stop right there. So listen for all of that stuff. Of course, you have studied this all before in detail with me in the previous part of this lecture. But listen for those things that are different, especially this new section here that is repeated from the beginning of this part of the lecture. And the little things that the strings do to make the piece more orchestral and less of a pure band composition. All of these other little details in the winds here. Also listen for the role of the second trombone, helping to add a little bit of weight down there with the third trombone. Probably just a little bit of insurance for Berlioz, who was worried about the strength of the strings. And you've got all of this low scoring here from our middle strings, and so obviously that would be something he'd want to adjust and compensate for in the rest of the orchestra. But yeah, listen for the swirls and how they work with the harmony that is happening around them and this little push from beneath. And then, of course, how this is set up right here with the pizzicato, very deliberate and fun way of getting back to the tonic. And this new section here with the trade-offs, bum, 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 bum. Notice that this first time there isn't any timpani to sort of take that place, but Berlioz adds it in on the second time. And really you kind of see that this is similar to the rhythmic timekeeping of the timpani. And then this jumping back and forth between sections of the orchestra. Just so much fun. Have a listen to all that. Enjoy all of Berlioz's little compensations and calculations. And I will see you for the final lecture of this movement coming really soon. Thanks everybody so much for your support and for keeping these lectures going. I really, really appreciate it. And our next big lecture series is going to be something completely different. So look forward to that after we do our big orchestration challenge in the middle of this year. See you guys soon.